I would like to introduce Dr. Jeff Prestemon. He's a leading scientist in disturbance economics at US Forest Service. He is the project leader and the senior forester at the Northern Forest Station in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. He did his PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison, MS from North Carolina State University, and he has a lot of experience in the area of economic analysis, including disturbance, carbon, housing markets, housing starts. Dr. Prestemon, I would like to let you talk now.
Thank you very much, Raju. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to talk. And if I would, I might just go ahead and start to share my screen and start that presentation. That sound like a good idea? Okay, here goes. All right, seeing that? Okay, good. Thanks again. And that's my title. It's what I said I was going to talk about, but it's great to be here. Yeah, I'm with the Southern Research Station, been with the Forest Service since 1995, actually, after I finished up there at UW-Madison in that year and started here in the Forest Service in the Southern Research Station in the Economics and Policy Work Unit. I also want to acknowledge what I'm going to be talking about today is work that I did collaboratively. In fact, almost everything I do is collaborative. And in fact, in this particular case, much of the work I'm going to be talking about today is work that I carried out with Dr. Prakash Nepal. He's also with the Forest Service out of the Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, as well as Kalamakanta Sahu, who was at the time at UW-Madison working with Prakash and me, and apparently now has left UW, but he has a nice, but I still correspond with him, and he was a great collaborator in this work. I also want to mention that this work actually leverages earlier work that I did with Dave Ware, Karen Apt, and Bob Apt. So in this larger team that I'm talking about here, we've done a lot of work on housing, the future, projecting carbon, and so this really summarizes some of the harvested wood products carbon work that I'm doing with Prakash, and I'll mention another piece that Prakash and I have been working on that just got published as well. So point you to that at the end of the presentation today. So I'm going to start with this bottom line up front. So basically, we find that we can predict new housing construction with fairly simple models across the United States. And this means we can predict housing constructions at fairly fine spatial scales across the United States. This is important for the forest products sector to know perhaps where future demand will be for wood products in the United States. It can also tell us a little bit about where that harvested wood products carbon may be stored in the form of these houses. And also at the end of the life of a house, it goes often into a solid waste disposal site. So basically we're burying that stuff and it continues to store carbon, and we can model that into the future with these fairly simple models. I will also say that there still are several questions remaining about the future of carbon and housing in the United States, and these are related more directly to climate change in ways that we did not model in this research. So climate change was not totally comprehended in this work. We're working hard to build on this particular study and other studies to understand more completely how climate change may be impacting the forest product sector, nationally as well as globally. So what I'm going to talk about today, first, a little bit about the wood products sector, the wood products consumption in the United States. Then I'll talk about housing historically in the United States. I'll briefly summarize how we did the research that I'm going to be talking about today and presenting results of, and then show some details about projections off into the future, and these are off to 2070, based on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change inspired Shared Socioeconomic Pathways. First, it's important to recognize that, that we're modeling housing construction, and we're modeling some of the wood that goes into the repair and renovation, repair and remodeling work that happens in structures in the United States. So it's important to understand that single family homes and multifamily homes only comprise about 30% of the total wood produced. So if we produce, let's say, 300 million cubic meters of timber, if we harvest 300 million cubic meters of timber in the United States, only about 30% of that is going to go into a wood product that goes into the housing sector. The rest of it is going to go into non-residential construction. It's going to go into repair and remodeling of existing structures. Some of it goes into furniture. Some of it goes into other kinds of manufacturing. Some of it actually, some of that wood is getting put into packaging, made into packaging. So I'm not talking about paper, I'm talking about wood packaging. So things like pallets. It could be also basically wood frames for large equipment that's being shipped, you know, that kind of thing. You've seen wood in those kinds of large crates. So that's that packaging and shipping component there, that 13% of all wood goes into that. Then there's a whole smattering of other uses, and including things like road building and other things I'm not going to get into this point. In terms of the wood products that are consumed in the United States, the three primary ones that go into construction are softwood lumber, softwood plywood, and oriented strand board. So softwood plywood and oriented strand board are the two structural wood-based panels. So anytime you go out and look at a new house being built, you'll see this OSB as sheathing, you know, around the house, up on the roof. Sometimes you'll see softwood plywood, although softwood plywood has shrunk over time, and in terms of its use in construction in the United States, being overtaken steadily by oriented strand board. So oriented strand board is about 2/3 of total structural wood-based panels. So between those three wood-based panels, the two wood-based panels and softwood lumber, we're talking about, you know, basically 3/4 of about 68, or, you know, something on the order of 3/4 of the wood in the United States wood products go into construction. Remainder into those other uses, like hardwood lumber and non-structural panels such as particle board, like medium density fiberboard, and that kind of thing. Let's put the housing sector into context. Across this country of about 330 million people, we have about 143 million housing units. So these housing units are everywhere. Most of them are single family. Many of them, and about 1/3 of them or so, are multifamily. So 143 million units. And it's also important to understand that each year we lose about 1/3 of a million of these housing units to decay, storms, house fires, tear downs. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen tear downs in some neighborhoods. People say, that's an old house, I'm going to tear it down and replace it with a large house, and that goes on. There's also something technical there about moving a mobile home. Once it's moved off of the site, then it's considered lost, and usually it is. But if it's moved on to another site, then it's a gain. Generally, anytime you move a mobile home, that's counted as a loss. US adds about a little over 1 million new units each year. So that's a mix of multifamily and single family, mostly single family. That number fluctuates a lot. So at the depths of the last big recession in 2007, 8, 9, we got down to, you know, basically about 500,000 housing starts in the United States. But at the peaks of, let's say, 2005, 2006, before we hit basically a huge collapse in the housing market, we were almost building 2 million units per year. The United States lately has been building over 1.5 million. So the last few years, That has been substantially dampened in the last few months because of rising interest rates and slowing economy. So that construction rate is set to go down even more than it currently is. A lot of the kind of the interest rate effects manifest themselves over time. Another thing to remember is that all those 143 million housing units, most of those 143 million housing units have wood in them, maybe a lot of wood. And that is one way that we store the wood, which is sequestered by trees, right? So trees sequester carbon through the process of absorption of sunlight and use of sunlight to take carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into wood, among other things. And then that wood is then added to the tree, and we sometimes cut that tree down and make a product out of it. Paper products that are made from those trees generally do not store carbon for very long, maybe a few years, maybe 3-6 years. You can think about it. Yeah, you might get your paper recycled a couple of times, and then eventually it gets burned up or decays, and so you lose that carbon. Wood, on the other hand, solid wood products, even particle board and those kinds of things, that can store carbon for a long time. So that carbon gets stored. Also a phenomenon in the United States and most wealthier countries around the world, this is not always true. Wood products that are at the end of their useful life, including these houses, goes into a dump. We like to call these solid waste disposal sites. So not only do we get, let's say, almost 100 years out of storage of the carbon that we get in a single family home, we get another several decades buried in a solid waste disposal site before that carbon eventually leaks out and goes into the atmosphere. So it does provide a long-term storage means in terms of the wood. Also want to mention that when we have these kinds of wood products going into houses, those are really substitutes for non-wood product building materials that could be used to build houses. And if you leave the United States and maybe say Nordic countries and some other countries in Europe and Canada, once you leave those countries, you see a lot lower rate of wood use in construction. So if you go to Asia, for example, most housing is not built with wood, or most of the materials in a house is not wood. It's concrete, brick, some other materials. So it's kind of a unique thing for North America, as well as parts of Northern Europe where housing is built mainly from wood. Go to Southern Europe, it's not. You go to the rest of the world, it's generally not. And those non-wood materials, they do not sequester any carbon. In fact, they in their manufacture, they produce a lot of emissions. So if you could replace, let's say, a concrete component with a wood component, then you'd be 2 steps ahead in terms of the carbon emissions characterization of that particular structure. Let's look at a little bit at housing starts in the United States since 1959. So we have good data since 59. We've had consistent data sets collected. This shows that the black line, the top black line, is total units started in the United States. Now, when I say started, most of you probably realize that you start building a house, the house gets finished. Eventually, maybe in 3 months, maybe in 6 months, maybe it takes even longer. But most houses that are started are completed. If you look at, you can get data on completed structures, you can get data on started structure, you can get data on permitted structures. So permits, and then you have a start, and then you have a completion. All of those pretty much move together in the data. So you can just look at starts and get a really good index of what's going on in terms of demand for wood in construction in the United States. What we see here going back to 1959 to today is there's been a noticeable slide in the overall number of units started. What that means is that as the economy has gotten more mature, or economic growth has slowed, population growth has slowed, I'll get into that in a second, then we're going to see fewer and fewer units needed or demanded and then built. That's true especially for single family houses. I can break up the single and multifamily by region, and you can see the same kinds of patterns here. Here I broke out single family starts by US Census Bureau region. There are 4 regions. One is the north, which is basically northeastern quarter of the northeastern quarter. Then there's the Midwest, then there's the South, and then there's the West, which is basically Rockies West, including Alaska and Hawaii. So we have, you can see that the patterns are similar across these regions. They're not the same. The biggest rates of construction are in the South, where I happen to be. So you go outside, we're in a very fast growing region, and there's a lot of construction going on. You can go to, some cities in the Northeast which is really the lowest level of construction these days. And you're not seeing a lot of new houses built, but they do build some. And those rates have gone down for the Northeast and the Midwest, to some extent in the West as well. But the South, there is a downward trend long term, but it's still the big kahuna in terms of construction rates. Multifamily, it's a slightly different pattern. There was a lot of multifamily being built in the 1980s. That really came down a lot by the early 90s when we had a recession there. And they've been bouncing around ever since. I would say this, that trends for multifamily are pretty much not there. There's really no trend in multifamily. Most of the trend downward over time is in the single family category. And our projections bear that. You'll see that projected into the future. So let me just summarize briefly the research objectives for this, this study. So what we wanted to do was model economic and population growth separately as drivers of new construction, right? I'll mention in a second that this work builds on earlier work that I did with Karen Apt and Bob Apt and others, where we projected out into the future just using economic growth as the main driver. Dave Ware also was involved in that work. And then what we've done in this new work is add population change to the modeling. And that really does produce a different picture about what may be happening, what may happen in the United States over time in the next 5 decades or so. Another thing that we did not do in that earlier work with Dave Ware, Karen, and Bob Apt was project housing at a fine spatial scale. Those were national models. We decided to estimate these at census region models and then come up with a process for projecting construction at the county level. So we have 3,000 counties in the United States, more than 3,000. And we were able to develop individual models for every one of those counties. And so then we could project out construction levels in every county in America. And given a scenario of growth of population, income, and a couple other variables, we can project out county level construction up into some indefinite future. As far into the future as you have projections or a scenario that you want to run about the future. With that information, we can also estimate the amount of carbon stored in these houses and in the solid wood disposal sites nearby. And so given that information, we can tell anyone where is that harvested wood carbon in the United States at a fairly fine spatial scale. That's new work. No one's done as far as we know. So that was another addition to the literature or to the knowledge base, is really understanding where we're going to predict, where are we going to have housing in the future, and then where is the carbon. I will mention, excuse me, I've got a cough here, that we're not the only ones that project construction at the county level. Some of you have heard of excuse me, Woods and Pool. Woods and Pool puts together, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cough again. I can't even see my mute to do that. Woods and Pool puts together its own projections of numbers of housing units or numbers of households into the future. And Woods and Poole does not try to project by different kinds of scenarios. So what we're doing is creating a model that anybody could use to project out into the future. Apologize for that. This is maybe a little too much information. It's about how we did this work. So to summarize, we had separate models for single family homes and multifamily homes. We had projections of income and population growth at the county level. And that was based on research that I did with Dave Ware, published a couple of years ago in PLOS One. And what we did is we came up with a way of downscaling income and population projections from any scenario. Ours were from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Shared Socioeconomic Pathways. So we were able to project out population and income at a fine scale, given principles of economic convergence, which comes from economic theory, that over time, incomes per capita will converge so that poor places, people, families, lower income families in those places have a higher rate of economic, or let's say income growth than wealthier families or wealthy people in another place. So over time, there's this general convergence where poorer places get wealthier faster than richer places. That's a principle that's been found at the county level in the United States, based on historical data. It's been found at the state level nationally in the United States, and it's been found globally across countries. So there is this general process of convergence in incomes per capita that happen over time. And that is built into our projections of income and population, income growth, especially across the counties of the United States. And that's part of our model. So we're building in this economic principle of income convergence. I could talk a little bit more about the weakening of that let's say rule in the most recent data, but that is a general structure then. After we have projections of houses at the county level, then we apply a model to quantify the harvested wood products carbon in those houses, as well as in the solid wood disposal sites, solid waste disposal sites in the United States. Let me tell you a little bit about the shared socioeconomic pathways. I'm sure some of you have heard of these. These, again, came out of the fifth climate assessment, IPCC fifth assessment, and they are based on generally 5 futures that could happen to the world. So these futures kind of span different kinds of dimensions. Maybe we become more equal. So this convergence process happens faster. That's what I would call SSP1. So this green future, not only do we have more green energy sources, we have generally greater equality or less inequality over time across around the world. Next is what they often call the business as usual, SSP2, and we have just basically almost historical rates of income and population growth and income convergence that's applied for the United States as well as globally. There's SSP3, which we can shorthand it by saying it's a poor future. So for the United States, SSP3 has the lowest rate of income growth. It also has, for the United States and not all countries, but it also has a low population growth projection. So this could be because of our low income that we don't have as much immigration. Or you could say there are immigration policies that are brought out that keep people from coming into the United States. So we have a low population growth. There's SSP4, which is this kind of divergence future where the wealthy countries get wealthier and the poor ones hardly make any progress. And those kinds of principles can also be applied at the county level in the United States, and they're embodied in our county level projections. And then finally, there's SSP5, which is, you might call it a fossil fuel intensive future. There is still some renewable energy being produced under the SSP5, but it's the wealthiest future. And for the United States, it's also the highest population growth future. It's different for the rest of the world. Most of the other countries in the rest of the world, SSP 5 is a lower population growth feature, but SSP 3 is the high population growth. We have it flipped for the United States. So here's the projected income growth by SSP for the United States by decade. So these are growth rates. Generally, SSP 5, you can see it has pretty high growth rate until through the 2030s, almost 3% real annual economic growth in the United States. And then the other ones are lower, and you can see the green line there on the bottom is SSP 3. That's the lowest growth rate, and we have growth rates really trending down to just over about 0.7% per year in GDP growth. It's notable, and just keep in mind that historically in the United States, our economic growth or income GDP growth per year in real terms, that's inflation adjusted terms, has been trending down for the last 70 years. So slowly but surely, our growth rates on average are lower and lower and lower. That actually is consistent with this global rate of income convergence as well. So you have poorer countries, let's say China, that has had very rapid economic growth. The United States has had slowing economic growth. That's the convergence I was talking about before. And you can see that China has actually really getting close to middle income status, I think, globally in terms of income per capita. So those kinds of things are important to keep in mind. And across all of these SSPs, from the IPCC and this modeling done by the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, out of Vienna, they're showing generally slower rates of economic growth over time in the United States, regardless, yet SSP 5 is high, SSP 3 is low. The others are in between. Here's population growth under the SSPs for the United States. You can see the highest growth is 5 at 1% per year over the next 50 years, or projected over these 60 years, 2010 to 2070. SSP 3 is the low one, with average growth over those 60 years almost 0. But if you look at SSP 3, the projection is actually positive to negative growth in population. So by the mid 2030s or so, you see negative population growth in the United States under SSP 3. SSP 2 and 1 and 4 are in between. And I put in here a little red line indicating that population growth actually in the United States has slowed considerably. We are, just the last 10 years, we've slowed down from about 6 or 7 tenths of a percent per year, so 0.7% per year, to the latest data point between 2020 and 2021, we grew at only 0.12%. So we're almost at zero population growth in the United States right now, in reality. So that means we're closer to the SSP 3 scenario, perhaps, in terms of population. You know, you could draw out those trends, and in my own little simple linear trend of changes would show that we'll reach zero population growth by the end of this decade in the United States. Could even be reaching it sooner than that. And now some of this very low rate we're seeing here, 0.12%, does include the pandemic, where we had 500, 600, 700,000 people die in the year 2021. And that definitely bumped up our mortality rate. So we have a higher mortality rate than we have historically. So that's bringing down the number. I know that's cold way to describe it, but some of this slower rate may be due to the pandemic. I'm not going to talk about the econometrics. That's too detailed, but because I've already kind of spoken a little bit about it. It's basically pivoting off of earlier work that I did with Dave Work, Kieran, and Bob Arendt. So let's get into the projections of housing in the United States. So I'm going to show you total as well as single family projections and multifamily projections off to 2070 for all 5 of these shared socioeconomic pathways models. I also have a kind of a historical rate, so that's not quite a business as usual, but it is a more close to a historical rate of economic growth shown here. So here's what we're projecting for single family housing nationally in the United States. So this is adding up across all of those counties, all the regions, and summing up all the single family houses built in the United States off to the future by each one of these scenarios, these SSPs. Notice that even under SSP 5, which is the highest economic growth and the highest population growth, by 2070, we're down to single family housing rates of just about 500,000 per year, which is, you know, down by half compared to today. And that just comes right out of the model. Under SSP 3, which is that low growth, low economic growth, low population growth, or negative population growth, we reach replacement levels of housing by the 2040s or so. So that's 20 years from now. We're only going to be, under that scenario, we would only be building enough houses to replace the ones that are destroyed from those various causes I listed earlier. For multifamily housing, it's a slightly different story. We see that basically stability there. We're at kind of high compared to average historical rates of multifamily housing. And the models tell us we're just going to go back to those longer term trends. And there's really no change in the future in our multifamily housing construction rate across any scenarios. Although you can see there that the highest growth scenario, SSP 5, does have the highest rate of construction of multifamily housing. But if you compare these two, here's the single family, about 500,000 under SSP 5 per year by 27. And for multifamily, we're at about 300,000 by 2070. So over time, it looks like the models would suggest that we're going to have a greater and greater share of multifamily housing in the United States. Here's, just for fun, here's the Midwest. Notice here this cluster in the upper left there is the historical. So the model does a pretty good job of predicting the historical rates that we've observed here in the Midwest. And it shows a rapid decline in rate of construction under SSP3. And so we have these projections. We can do these, and we have these in the paper as well. Projections for different regions of the United States as well as by county. So here's multifamily in the Midwest. Basic stability. Now, with all of that, we then downscaled housing construction in the future by these shared socioeconomic pathways. So I have here 6 maps. In the upper left, so this is single family housing starts between 2020 and 2070. In the upper left is really the starting point. SSP 1 looks just like SSP 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's the starting rate of new single family homes built by county in the United States. And we project out under each one of these SSPs off to 2070. You'll see very little difference across these models in terms of new levels of housing starts in the future. There are very subtle differences across these models, but generally by 2070, we're still building houses. It's only slightly lower. And there are still pockets where there's high construction now, which is like the southwestern US and parts of the Northeast corridor and Florida. And then across the rest of the SSPs, you see that same general pattern. Those same general areas are still getting hit with getting new houses built, and that just carries out. But there are very slight differences. If you look at these maps, you could see that, especially in maybe some of the interior parts, the Rocky Mountain region, there are differences across these SSPs in the rates of construction. Multifamily, you saw that there is very little difference between these SSPs and the rates of multifamily housing construction. So really very little change in the rates of housing detectable in this big map. Now, the problem with this big map is that it has a lot of counties with very few people. And so you don't have many houses built. All the action is on the coasts, basically, and maybe even in the Great Lakes states. So you have in the Northeast corridor. So you have this kind of this Northeast, Florida, California, Oregon, Washington center of activity, maybe Arizona as well. But it really doesn't seem to vary very much across these SSPs. And here's the total. It really, you can see a little bit more differences across these different scenarios of the future. So we can project where all these houses would be built. And yes, under SSP 5, you can see some counties which were yellow before and now are greener, which means higher rates of construction. But subtle differences there. Okay, so we can take those maps or the county level projections and then turn those into projections of harvested wood product carbon in every one of those structures across the whole country. So the 143 million units, and by 2070 we'll have maybe close to 200 million housing units in the United States. Depends on the scenario. Maybe closer to 180 million. And then we can calculate carbon. Right now, it's important to understand that the average contribution of U.S. housing sector to total harvested wood products carbon was about 51 to 85. That's projected off of the future. 51 to 85 million tons of carbon per year sequestered or stored in these units, and then also we're showing here the carbon stored at the beginning of our projection is about 110 million metric tons in houses. Here's a figure which gives kind of a national picture of what's happening with harvested wood products carbon that's stored in houses and in solid wood disposal sites. The one on the left is cumulative carbon stored over that 50-year times 50+ year time span. So actually, our projections start about 2016 or so. And we project out to 2070. So we can see that under SSP 5, we are really accumulating a lot of carbon over the next 50 years or so. But across all of these scenarios, the rate of additions is declining. So because we have a slowing economy, generally slowing population growth rate, the additions to harvested wood products carbon decline over time. They don't get to zero. They almost get kind of level off by the end of the projection. And that's because houses last a long time and you can store a lot of carbon in landfills. And you can map these as well. So here's the map of where all this carbon is and the changes under the SSP. So what we've developed here is a map of changes, and you can use that to really identify where all that harvested wood products carbon. You can see a little bit more differences across counties over time by scenario, so this is informative under SSP. Under SSP 3, which is the lower left, it's pretty red, not a whole lot of new additions into it, but under SSP 5, it's a little greener and yellower, and that's the lower right. I didn't label these here, but the SSP 5 is in the lower right. So what did we find? We found that we can project housing construction if we have in hand already projections of income and population. And that's work that we've done, Dave Ware and I did, to project income and population at the county level. So if you wanted to know what kind of construction level is going to be in a county, all you need to tell me is what income and population growth will be in that county, and we can tell you. And there are models that project that out, not just ours, but others that can tell us what future population could be in the United States. We can turn our housing projections into a map of where all that harvested wood products carbon is stored. And our results generally show across all of those scenarios that rates of storage increases are going down over time, and that's consistent with a slowing population growth as well as a slowing economy over time. But they don't reach zero. That rate of increase in carbon stored in harvested wood products does not ever stop. throughout the next 50 years or so. One thing I'll mention here is that our model is not, obviously it's not perfect, there are errors. We do a really good job, actually very low error rates at the county level in our models. So we can predict with quite a lot of precision how many housing units will be built. And that is based on historical data. And we did a counterfactual analysis there to try to understand how well the model predicts out of sampling. What our models don't really do is bring in changes in disturbances into the housing sector. So you know that with climate change, people are projecting, let's say, higher rates of wildfire, maybe changes in hurricane patterns, hurricane intensities. You might expect that some of those hurricanes are going to destroy some houses through their storm surges or even through wind. Fires can burn up some houses. And we don't bring that directly into this model, into our modeling. And so we really don't have effects of hurricanes, or sea level rise for that matter also is not involved in this model. Sea level rise, of course, is going to affect counties or places along coasts. And so if we were to factor, I will mention though that we do have a paper just published on the impacts of sea level rise in the forest product sector. And generally for the United States, it adds about 2% to new construction per year. So instead of, I don't know, multiply 1.2 million times 1.02, you'll get the new number. It's not a whole lot of new units being built in the United States, maybe 30,000 per year additional demand for housing in the United States due to the losses of houses to these rising seas. The effects on timber growth and timber supply and prices are not factored in here. So we're not also projecting timber. That could affect the prices of wood products. And then that would affect, of course, the demand for wood going into some of these structures, and maybe even how often non-wood substitutes may be used in the process of building. Our models also don't account for internal migration patterns. So we do have projections of population and income by county, but in those models from Dave Ware and me, we did not account for how climate may be affecting where people are moving within the United States. So where they may be moving because of sea level rise, or where they may be moving because they don't like the climate in the place where they currently live, and they'll go to a place where maybe it's more favorable for them. So that's not in the model. I'm going to conclude here before opening for questions. There's the top citation. There is the one that this paper is what I presented, and the next one down is the paper that I published with Dave Ware, Karen, and Bob Aft back in 2018, which laid the foundation for the new work, at least in the housing starts component of this research. Also, as of yesterday, I had a paper published with Prakash Nepal, my main co-author in this work I presented today. We have a paper on how that sea level rise may be impacting carbon as well as construction globally. And we have projections by country off into the future on housing impacts and the carbon that's stored in those houses and impacts on the floor. So encourage you all to read that paper if you get a chance. It's a nice paper, I think, in global environmental change, and it really does. It can help put some of this work I presented today into some context about the importance of that global housing demand due to sea level rise. That may impact some of our results as well, and that's not factored in this particular study today. So I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So you can either put the question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask questions. Anything is fine. So yeah, let's go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. It's a great talk. Thank you so much. And I have a question. So you talked about the lost homes and the materials became solid waste, and I'm wondering that is there's any other ways that the materials are repurposed. For instance, the wood material is reused to build new house, or they become the fuel for the wood stove or something like that, instead of going to the waste and decay over the time.
That's a great question, and what we used when we came up with an assumed rate based on historical average patterns of solid waste disposal from these destroyed structures. And if there are policies or trends happening that change how that wood is used or disposed of, that would affect our results. So no, we don't project out changing rates of, let's say, wood recycling or use of wood in the construction wood in the energy sector. That could be in there. It's not in there. That would be an additional study that I'd find interesting, actually. So it would be, I know that there are people looking at that, and I think it's a big thing in some parts of the world where they're trying to make sure that you use wood more than once. It's not going straight to the dump, and it's important it would be an important way of keeping that carbon stored before it gets emitted and hurts us in the future.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, Larry has a hand up.
There's Larry.
Yes, hi, Ben. Hey, two quick questions. One is, we hear more and more about mixed use construction with, usually commercial at the bottom and residential at top. And so one question is, how is that handled in your modeling? And then a second question I have for you is, just in general, you were talking about housing here. Mm-hmm. What about the non-housing solid wood sectors, and how do they relatively compare to the housing sectors?
The non-wood, the non-residential construction, the non-wood, non-residential buildings in the United States, they use comparatively low amount of wood. It's not a lot. Construction wood is maybe about, I think I showed the statistic earlier on, but it's more like it's less than 10% of wood that goes into these non-residential. We did not model non-residential. That's a different paper. Actually, I'm working on with Prakash right now to project out what may be happening with the non-residential sector under these same scenarios. And that work is going to really try to understand how changing rates of say mass timber products could affect the amount of wood consumed as well as stored in the form of for carbon storage into the future. And so, good point. We didn't bring in the non-residential sector, and it's important. Now, that piece of there are some buildings that have some residences up top and commercial down below or something, those residences that are in parts of those buildings, it would be counted in terms of the multifamily, perhaps. I'm not 100% sure how many those are in the data, and now that you've asked me that question, I'm not sure how those would be counted in the data, but I'm sure that census wouldn't leave them alone. I'm just really unsure about their relative scale.
Okay, thank you.
Iksha, go ahead.
My question may be a little bit out of the scope of your study. I understand that, but just wanted to know if you are thinking of that aspect as, because you indicated that the projection in one of your conclusion that there is a slowing addition of harvested wood product to carbon, but it is actually not zeroing. Is it because of maybe the climate change impacts that would destroy the housing, and then that would cause a lot of renovation, restoration of the houses? That's why the addition of the harvested wood products to carbon would not zero, because you also consider the impacts of climate change destroying and the role of that in renovation of the housing as well, whichever would use the harvested wood products for building that house. I don't know if that's clear, but just wanted to account if you're also considering that aspect of climate change impacts in your study.
We did not directly model how climate change would affect the rate of housing loss. And that's work that should be done, but it's not in our model. So basically, we're looking at statistics on our models say how many new houses are going to be built, and we have a rate of housing destruction that we built into the model, but that destruction rate is just not. It's not a function of climate, and could have made it a function of sea level rise, for example, but we didn't, and because it predated this new work that I've done with Prakash. And beyond that, not sure how important, let's say, changes in disturbances will be when it comes to losses of houses. So hurricanes come to mind, and because they can destroy a lot of housing units. Katrina, there are 200,000 housing units destroyed with Hurricane Katrina in 2000. That's a significant share. And if we were to have more of those kinds of Cat 5 hurricanes coming into populated areas, you might have an accelerated rate of loss of some of these structures. Hurricane models, projections are all over the map, so to speak. No pun intended. Not really sure where they're going in terms of frequency and intensity. Generally, in the North Atlantic, hurricane intensities are projected to rise, although the numbers of hurricanes may not rise. It may, in fact, go down based on basically atmospheric science that I don't want to get into, but I've looked a little bit at that, and so it's anybody's guess what may be happening with those kinds of losses to the housing sector, but they're not trivial. And you can think about Hurricane Sandy that hit about this time a few years ago, and it hit a very heavily populated area, New York, New Jersey. A lot of units were destroyed, and there's talk about hurricanes changing basically where they're going to make landfall, and if they start to shift north, well, then northeastern United States is a high population level. Those could really be starting to have some impacts. I was just talking to a neighbor from Canada yesterday. She lives in Nova Scotia. A couple of weeks ago, we had Hurricane Fiona. It hit Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland and destroyed houses. There was some storm surge. There was also a lot of timber damage, and that's an interesting thing to think about. But they do have hurricanes hitting those Atlantic provinces. But that, I think it could be, maybe we're starting to get more evidence that we're going to have more of these high impact storms hitting populated regions in along the East Coast. So it's a good question about how climate could be maybe built into these a little bit better.
Thank you.
So, okay. So if I have a question, so mass timber is getting very popular, and we are building like big buildings, small buildings, all kinds of building out of it. So do you think that would have a impact on, harvested wood product carbon stored, or even on the housing stats?
Much of the growth, I think, that people envision in the use of mass timber is going to be in the multifamily and the non-residential, not in the single family. Single family is really not part of, probably not much of the demand for this kind of mass timber. It's the multifamily sector. And how could that be? That could be stimulated through policies. It could be stimulated just through, we have new international building codes in the United States that have tried to make mass timber use in construction, multifamily as well as non-residential, easier or allowed under certain kinds of precautionary applications. So it's possible that it could become huge. Right now, it's not a big demander for wood. Mass timber is a very small slice of, it's actually counted in lumber in our models. It's a small slice of total wood demand at this wood production at this point in the United States. It could get big. We look at oriented strand board, 1985. I mentioned maybe we had basically zero oriented strand board. Now it's 2/3 of our panels. It just exploded in its use, and that was a brand new product. That could happen to mass timber. We could just like massive adoption, and just it's everywhere, and it's a significant demand center.
Yeah. So we have one question in chat from Naresh. On an average, how much wood is utilized while constructing a multifamily house in Midwest?
Oh,
Have any idea?
I don't off the top of my head. I know I had that number at one point, and it escapes me at this moment. So I'll have to get back to you on that if you want me to. I'll send you that information. We had that actually built into a press release, and
Okay.
I don't have that at my fingertips.
Okay. So any other questions, any comments? Okay, if not, then let's give a round of applause for Jeff for his wonderful presentation. And thank you so much, Jeff, for accepting our invitation and doing a great talk. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon in one of the SPRI or SF meetings.
Yes, hopefully soon. Okay, man. Talk to you later. Good to meet everybody.
Thank you, Jeff.